The fire raged like a living thing, curling its greedy fingers around the skeletal remains of the apartment complex. Smoke billowed into the night sky, thick and suffocating, as firefighter Laura Daniels sprinted through the corridor, her oxygen mask fogging with each ragged breath. Through the thick haze, she found him, an elderly man slumped against a scorched doorframe, his frail body trembling with each cough. His face was smeared with soot, his eyes wide with something beyond fear. "Sir, I've got you," Laura said, kneeling beside him, gently wrapping an arm around his shoulders. His skin was paper-thin, damp with sweat. He gripped her arm weakly, his breath coming in shallow, wheezing gasps. "Please," he whispered, "find my grandson. Tell him I love him." Laura felt a sharp tug in her chest. "I will," she promised, pulling him to his feet. "But right now, we need to get out of here." The man clung to her as they stumbled toward the exit, the heat pressing down on them like an unbearable weight. Just a few more steps, just a little farther. But then, his body sagged against her. "No, no, stay with me," she urged, shaking him gently. His lips moved again, barely audible through the roar of the flames. "Tell him, I love him." And then, nothing. Laura sat in the fire truck an hour later, the sounds of crackling flames replaced by the mechanical hum of the water hoses. Her gear was soaked, her hands trembling as she stared down at them. She had done everything she could, but it hadn't been enough. Her captain walked by, giving her a nod of reassurance, but Laura barely registered it. She was too caught up in the weight of the man's final words. "Find my grandson and tell him I love him." She didn't even know his name. Back at the station, Laura couldn't let it go. She pulled every report she could get her hands on, emergency contact sheets, tenant records, anything that might give her a lead. The elderly man's name was William Prescott, and according to the file, he lived alone. No next of kin listed. But Laura wasn't one to give up easily. She spent weeks digging through public records, making phone calls, even asking around the neighborhood where the fire had happened. And finally, she found something. A grandson named James Prescott. Tracking him down took even longer. When she finally stood outside his apartment, her nerves twisted in knots. The building was a far cry from the one his grandfather had lived in. Modern, pristine, cold. She knocked. James answered, looking at her with tired eyes that held none of his grandfather's warmth. He was in his early 30s, sharp features, dressed in a suit like he had somewhere more important to be. "James Prescott?" Laura asked, clearing her throat. He frowned. "Yeah, who's asking?" Laura took a deep breath. "I'm a firefighter. I was there the night your grandfather passed." James's expression didn't change, but Laura noticed the way his jaw tightened. "I don't know what you want from me." "I promised him something," she said. "His last words were for you. He wanted me to tell you he loved you." For a moment, Laura thought she saw something crack in his expression, something buried deep beneath years of distance. But then his face hardened again. "I haven't spoken to him in years," James said, his voice flat. "He had his chance." Laura blinked, stunned. "He cared about you, enough that his last thought was of you." James crossed his arms. "People don't get to say, 'I love you' at the last second and expect it to make up for everything. He was never there when I needed him. You don't get to fix that with a dying wish." Laura opened her mouth, but she had no words. She had expected gratitude, closure, but instead all she found was bitterness. "I'm sorry," James said, softer this time, though his eyes stayed distant. "But I moved on a long time ago." And with that, he shut the door. Laura stood outside the apartment complex for a long time, staring at the reflection of herself in the glass. She had spent so much time thinking she was fulfilling an important mission, keeping a dying man's last wish alive. But some wounds couldn't be healed with words, no matter how well-intentioned they were. She had done what she promised, and yet, it still didn't feel like enough. That night, Laura sat alone in the firehouse kitchen, nursing a cup of cold coffee. She pulled out a crumpled note from her pocket, the address of the apartment, scrawled in her handwriting. She thought about calling James again, trying one more time. But then she sighed, folded the paper, and tucked it away in her locker. Some things couldn't be forced, some goodbyes couldn't be rewritten, and as much as it hurt, she had to let go. She had kept her promise. Even if it wasn't the ending she had hoped for, the end